I am really now delighted. This is one of the true honors of my life, to be honest. Andrew has been one of them, but I get to talk to somebody who's, a hero for the world, and it gives me great great pleasure to do this. I'm so sorry. I haven't been nervous all week. I got a little bit nervous last night, and so this is one of those moments where I just have to get it together because I get to introduce someone who has been a mentor, a friend, again, a hero to the world, and that's Dr. Cary Fowler, the U.S. Special Envoy for Global Food Security in the U.S. State Department. He's a recipient of the 2024 World Food Prize. He helped found the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and he's done so many amazing things. Please give him a round of applause. He's literally one of my favorite people in the world. So I'm so glad to see you. Thank you for coming here and spending some time with us. I want to congratulate you on the World Food Prize. You and Jeffrey Houghton have done amazing things, and it's such a testament to the work. Can you just acknowledge it for a second and what it means to you personally?
I tell people if you live long enough, you get awards. I don't know what to say. I think it's good to get the attention for the issues we've been working on.
It really is, and we can talk about that in a minute. I want to talk about something you said. You said that people underestimate the complexities that our agriculture system will encounter both in the long term and the short term.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how the climate crisis is exacerbating the biodiversity loss crisis, which you've spent your whole life sort of trying to protect.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the projections that are being made about the impact of climate change on crop yields, what you're going to see looking out into the future is that the impacts are all negative to our major crops. So we sort of expect that we're going to get increased production year after year. But if you look at those projections, you'll see by 2050, the major staple crops, certainly in Africa, all have a negative, a minus sign behind them. So we need to produce substantially more food to meet food demand, and by the way, to meet food need, which is something different.
Right.
But we see a declining production level for some of these crops. And I think there are a couple of things going on. I think one is that we're not taking the climate crisis seriously enough. I think it's going to have multiple impacts on our farming systems that we haven't fully appreciated. Yes, our crops are going to have to adapt to higher temperatures and higher extremes, but they're going to have to adapt to fluctuations.
Yeah.
Picture yourself as a plant breeder and trying to breed a crop with the trait of being able to deal with much higher temperatures, but also sometimes lower temperatures and fluctuations, within a system, within a season. That's pretty rough, but also there are a couple other things going on with climate that never get factored into the models.
Yeah.
Species are on the move. That means pests and diseases. We are engaged now in the largest agricultural experiment in history. We're throwing different species together that have never lived together before. There are going to be some surprises.
So many surprises,
I don't think they're going to be positive surprises. And again, when you look at projections of crop yields or food production for the future, there are a number of other things we don't count into the mix. We don't count into the mix soil degradation, the loss of soil. The African Union, picture this, is saying that by 2050, perhaps half of the cropland in Africa will be unusable. That's their word, unusable. That will have an impact on production.
Sure.
And we have water crises. 21 of the 37 major aquifers in the world are being depleted faster than they're being replenished. We have conflict, and of course, food insecurity causes conflict, and conflict causes food insecurity. So there are a number of other headwinds that are facing us that I think add up to making the situation somewhat worse, unfortunately.
It is dire, but one of the things that you have been able to do to address the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, the conflict crisis, our public health crisis, is coming up with this idea, the vision for adapted crops and soils, which we call VACS. And it really looks at opportunity crops, crops that have that resiliency, that are nutritious, delicious, can withstand a lot of different things. Can you talk about that program and what you hope, where you hope it goes, and what you hope to see from it over the next several years?
Sure. Well, at the State Department, we did something in my office that I think was fairly simple. It was a no-brainer. We connected a few dots, and we realized that if you're going to have food security in the world, there are many things that we need to be doing and that you are doing that are great. There are a couple of things that we've got to do that are just fundamental. We have to take care of our soils. We have to have good, fertile soils. There's no food security if we don't have that.
Right.
And the second thing is our crops have to be adapted to climate change. So the biggest problem in the world at the moment, and I think in the near future, is going to be in Africa. The soils there are notoriously poor, and the crops are, by and large, unadapted. The hopeful thing about this is, and I think the thing that's most fascinating, really, is that when you look at the dominant staple crops in Africa, they're all crops that came from somewhere else. They're all imported crops. They're not indigenous crops.
Right.
We collectively haven't invested in those indigenous crops.
Yeah.
Now, some people would say, well, that's natural. They don't taste good. I grow them in my own garden.
I know.
I dare someone to tell me that. We haven't invested in them for a lot of reasons, and you can guess some of those reasons. So here are these crops, that some of which have never had a Mendelian-trained plant breeder working on them in human history. We went through a process. We started this Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. It's known by its acronym of VAX, co-sponsored by the African Union and by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And it was kind of a two-step process. One was we wanted to identify the crops that had the greatest potential for supplying more nutrition. And these were crops in all categories, like cereals and legumes and fruits and vegetables and roots and tubers and such. And we did that. We found out of about 300 indigenous crops, many of which I promise you will never have heard of, 60 that really met that criteria, and they were could be grown in all parts of Africa and provide food 12 months of the year, which is generally what we all need. And then we said, well, okay, we got these 60 highly nutritious crops. How are they going to do in climate change? And we did a huge amount of climate modeling. A group called AgMep did that. And we found out that most of those would do rather well in climate change scenarios. So there, for the first time in history, we had a basis for making rational decisions about where to put investments. And on the soil front, we thought, well, in the United States, a farmer will climb up into a big tractor linked with GPS and with information systems that will tell the farmer what the difference is in the soil from 1 meter to the next, and will apply different chemicals or whatever they're doing on that basis. In Africa, the data that the African governments have and that the farmers have is more like on the kilometers level, and you can't manage a 1 acre farm on a kilometer level information base. So, but we have that capacity now technologically to give farmers that type of information so that they can manage their systems better, and to give governments the information so they can make policy decisions about that. And if you combine those two things, it's a vision for adapted crops and soils, then what you get is the awareness of and the ability to put the right crop in the right soil so that you get good production, but also to choose the right crop that will nourish the soil as well. It goes in both directions. And by focusing on these highly nutritious crops, what we hope to do is change the conversation out here. We've been in a conversation about food security as long as I've been working in this field. What we really need to do is to be thinking about nutrition security. That's the real purpose of a food system, is nutrition security. And that's not going to be provided by 1 or 2 crops. It's not going to be provided by the staple crops alone. I'm very much in favor of continuing to work on the research and development of those staple crops. We need to expand that.
Yeah.
And that's how we deal with the kind of problems that you've heard already about today. Danny, I'm particularly motivated emotionally by the situation facing children in the world.
Sure.
And in so many countries, you have stunting rates that are just immoral.
Right, right.
We have expanded this vision for adapted crops and soils into Guatemala, and the stunting rate there is 47% among children under 5. This means that of the children under 5 in Guatemala, 47% of them will be cognitively and physically impaired, and this will last for the rest of their life. And when I mention this statistic, I always say to people, imagine your country, United States, wherever, if we had that kind of statistic, this would be a national crisis like we've never had before
Right.
in this country. And now imagine it in a country in the developing world. How are they going to develop? How are they going to be economically secure? How are they going to be peaceful
Right,
in the
right.
future if they're burdened and handicapped by this kind of situation?
So VAX really helps alleviate that setback that these countries are facing. It could really nourish those children, nourish those soils, set us on a right track for that food and nutrition security that's so important.
Should be a virtuous cycle.
Absolutely. I want to take a step back, and you've changed the vernacular from these underutilized crops or forgotten crops to opportunity crops, which is so optimistic and wonderful. Why didn't we invest? Let's just give a little history. Why didn't we invest in these crops?
Well, I think people know the history of Africa, and they know the reality of colonialism there, and they know that unfortunately, many of those systems have been set up not for the local people, but for others. And so Africa is the beneficiary, if you will, I put that in quotation marks, of many, many years of incentives to go in the other direction.
Yeah, it is. It's that burden of colonialism, and it's something we need to change. I want to switch gears a little bit. I get a lot of inside information because Dr. Fowler often talks to my husband, who works at Michigan State University. So I always get a little bit of nuggets.
Agricultural economist.
Yeah, great guy.
Runs in the family, I think.
And he told me a little secret about how you're bringing together Nobel laureates, World Food Prize laureates for something kind of special in October. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can talk a little bit about that. Quietly among friends, not in public. But the basis for that discussion is simply the understanding that we are going to fall short of meeting food needs in 2050. If I can jump back just for a moment and say that one of the real benefits of my job at the State Department the last 2.5 years is actually becoming, I think, personal friends with Cindy McCain at the World Food Program. She and my boss, Secretary Blinken, have, I think, the 2 hardest jobs in the world.
Right.
And you couldn't persuade me to take her job. I think it's just, she's an amazing person. She and the World Food Program face an impossible task. We've got more than 700 million people that are food insecure. The goal, as we heard today with food program, is to feed 150 million of those 750. And fundraising is not easy and is not on target to reach the goal for this year. This is not good.
Right.
At the same time that I think we need to be very much focused on that humanitarian need, I don't think anybody would disagree with that, we've got to look at the long term as well. And that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
And when I look at what people think about and the action they engage in, they're much more prone to look at the short term, that's the humanitarian relief, the medium term, let's have a project here or there to address some issue. We don't have as many people, as much attention, and certainly not as much funding going into addressing the long-term problem.
Yeah.
Now, if we're really humanitarians, we've got to do all the above. But if we ignore the long term, then that immediate humanitarian need is obviously going to grow, and I don't see our ability or our willingness to meet it in the future. So we've got to narrow down that gap between what we need in the future and what we're able to produce. We're not on target
Right.
to meet food demand, which is need and desire backed up by money in the marketplace. And we're not on target to meet food need, which is by definition the need of people that don't have the money to go into the marketplace. Frankly, they're not even expressing the need for food
Yeah.
as demand in the marketplace because they don't have the money for it. So we've got to do something about that. And I think in the time that we've got left, I think about the end of this current administration, which is when my job could come to an end. Then, what can we do? And I think we have to sound the alarm bells.
Yeah.
So what can we do in the next couple of months? Well, we're going to have a meeting. We're going to call together a small group of Nobel laureates who are scientists well known for their research abilities, obviously, and World Food Prize laureates to talk about this issue. And I don't want to anticipate what they're going to do, but one option is to say something about the issue in a very public way. And that should be, we hope, begin to change the conversation about how we need not only to meet current needs, but we need to plan to meet future needs. And since agricultural work and boosting food production is not something you can take a pill and do overnight,
Right.
If we know that some big problem is coming in 2050, and I believe the research of the climate scientists and the agricultural scientists, and I believe that if you do believe that research, you need to act on that belief,
Right.
then we need to plan backwards from 2050, and that time to start that work is today.
Absolutely. And that belief in science, I think, has been fundamental to the conversations I've been hearing all week, that we need to trust the science and the scientists and these experts, and also the sort of citizen and traditional knowledge that you've seen all over the world and that I've seen. It's incredible. If those two can be combined, we could really make progress in concrete ways. And in the final 3 minutes that we have left, Dr. Fowler, I'm hoping that you can give this audience, it's something I've been trying to do all week, ask experts like yourself, what is your call to action? What is your call to action for those researchers and those scientists? What is your call to action to policymakers and leaders across the world? And what is your call to action to all of us as eaters?
Well, I think all of us who work in this space need to be, I've already mentioned thinking long term. I think we need to think more boldly and aspirationally. I think sometimes we have too modest goals. Let's think much bigger. When I had my first meeting with Secretary Blinken when I came to the State Department, he very nicely and quietly said, "What do you want to do here?" And I said, "Well, I want to do something really big that has a lot of impact and has a huge return on investment, great cost-benefit ratio, that's sustainable, and that can't easily be undone. That if there's a future administration that doesn't believe in climate change or food security." And he chuckled and pointed at me and said, "Go for it." So I took that as license to do what I'm doing now. Obviously, we all need to be engaged. I think that I would invite you to try something, a little bit of an experiment with yourselves. And that is whether you think you're in the space of trying to meet immediate needs, or you sort of think that you're in the space that I've defined as medium term, let's have a project, agricultural project, development project, or you think, as I do, kind of naturally, maybe it's a psychological issue for me, I don't know, I tend to think long term.
Sure.
Svalbard Global Seed Vault was certainly very much
Very
long term. I would invite you to step out of that category that you're in and just spend a few minutes thinking about one of the other categories. So if you're in the very short term area, which is absolutely necessary. Think about how you would analyze the problem and what you would think solutions would be if you were in the long-term bucket. And because those are kind of things that need to be done, and I think there are ways of linking the short-term to the long-term.
Yeah.
And I'm discussing that with some of the people that are on the opposite end of the spectrum
Sure.
from me. So I think that's really important to do, because I think we can collaborate. We're all part of it. I guess the other thing is, and you've said you're optimistic. I'm not optimistic 24/7.
Sure. No,
You know?
no one
I'm
can
not.
be.
I look at what Russia has done in Ukraine, and that really makes my blood boil.
Sure.
And we're facing a lot of problems there that are self-inflicted wounds that we shouldn't be facing. I think it's a crime against humanity, frankly, that hundreds of thousands of what they call butterfly mines have been dropped on Ukrainian farm fields. They're not big enough to take out a tank, but they're big enough to take out your leg.
Right.
On farm fields, little tiny things, camouflaged, so people don't know if they're going to step on them. This is a crime against food security. It's a war against food security, not just Ukrainian people. So there are a lot of bad things like that, and I think working on food security, you can work even on that particular issue. Two other very quick things. This is a bit of a multinational audience, I know. Tell your governments what your priorities are. Don't assume that your governments are all in favor of this and are just doing the right thing. Even if they're doing the right thing, tell them congratulations, that's great, we applaud you, do more of it. They need to hear. And the final thing is, and I think, is not to give up. I'm never the smartest person in the room, and good ideas don't drop down from the heavens. But if you're stubborn and you're really persistent and you keep going, you can do a lot of good work. And I always tell people that I think pessimism is being in a car where you're sitting in the passenger side of the car and you're about to crash, and you start pumping the imaginary brakes or steering like this to get out of the way. That's really pessimism.
Sure.
Optimism is not the guarantee of success. It's the guarantee of your agency. It's the guarantee of an ability to do something, the right and the power to engage and do something. We all have that, so we shouldn't give up.
What a hopeful way to end. You are a true public servant, my friend. Thank you for your service to this country and to the world. Please give Dr. Cary Fowler a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.